Okay. Good morning and welcome back to our second class on the Haggadah, the story that we recite on the night of Passover, on the 2 nights of Passover. In truth, we already started the Haggadah yesterday. Yesterday, on Shabbat, it is customary to recite the first part of the Haggadah as a preview of what is to come. Yesterday had a special title. It was called Shabbat Haggadah, the Great Sabbath. And the reason why it was given this title, there are many reasons given, but the most fundamental reason is that right before the Exodus, a miracle occurred. When the Jewish people, who were then called the Israelites — what kind of a beer is that, Israelite? When the Israelites were told to take a lamb on the 10th day of the month and tie it to their beds in anticipation of the offering, the Paschal offering, the Egyptians were curious to see Jews taking lambs, bringing them into their homes, tying it to their beds. They said, "What's going on?" They said, "Well, you know, we had 9 plagues. There's going to be a 10th plague. This is a real doozy, this 10th plague. All you firstborn Egyptians are going to die." And the Egyptians, knowing that Moses, who made threats, the threats materialized, so they were terrified that all firstborn would die. So they ran to Pharaoh and his henchmen, and they said, "Let those Jews go already. How much do we have to suffer?" And Pharaoh resisted. And civil war broke out, where the firstborn Egyptians, who were the elite, the aristocracy of Egypt, were fighting to let the Jews go. Isn't that a miracle? When anti-Semites are fighting for the freedom of the Jewish people. And that's the symbol of this Shabbat, which was yesterday, the idea that the ultimate goal of existence, and this is the only explanation why there is evil in this world, is that the evil itself will be transformed into good. That's the ultimate goal and objective of the whole experience of Passover. We're not just trying to escape evil or even destroy evil. We want it transformed. Now, there are certain forms of evil that you can't salvage, you can't transform. But most evil, and this is true about us internally, we all have different flaws. And most of our flaws are salvageable. We don't have to destroy them. We have to reframe them. We have to take, let's say, greed, negative trait, and use it for something positive. Take anger and use it for indignation when you see something being done that's an injustice. You can take all of our flaws, most of our flaws, I should say, and you can transform them. That's the ultimate goal of liberation, of the Exodus from Egypt. There's another reason why it's called Shabbat Haggadah, the Great Shabbat, because it can be translated as the mature Shabbat, the Shabbat of maturity. The whole idea of Passover, there's many paradoxes. One of the paradoxes is that we focus on the child, literal child, on the child within us, to recapture the innocence of a child, even as we are mature. But we also want that innocence to be fused with maturity. What's maturity in terms of Judaism? This can be a whole series of lectures. What is the difference between infantile Judaism, where we sing some jingles in Hebrew school, and you sing those jingles in kindergarten and in 1st grade and in 2nd grade and in 8th grade, and you graduate knowing a few nice jingles. That's what Passover fights against, this Shabbat in particular, mature Judaism. Just to give you a few examples of what I mean by mature Judaism. What is God? God is not something remote. Everything in this universe is a manifestation of God. What is Torah? Torah is not just nice stories and laws, it's divine wisdom. What is a mitzvah? A mitzvah is not just a good deed. A mitzvah is what connects you to God. And we can go on, that there's an infantile way of looking at Judaism and there's a mature way. And the whole goal is we go from maturity to Passover's focus on the child within us, that the maturity should not be at the expense of the purity of our souls, of the innocence, the childlike innocence. So let's get to the Haggadah itself, which is the story of the Exodus, which starts with a paragraph. This is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. We're referring to the matzah. This is the bread of affliction. And then we say, whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. Whoever is in need, let him come and conduct the Seder of Passover. We're inviting people. This year, we are here. Next year in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves. Next year we will be free people. So the first question is, there are three statements over here, and they seem to be disjointed. What's the connection? Second question, when you talk about the matzah, you're calling it a bread of affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Isn't matzah eaten because they left Egypt in such haste that they didn't have enough time for the dough to rise? That's what it says in the Torah. And here we're saying, no, this is the bread that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Why are we focusing on a different aspect of the matzah, not on the aspect of liberation, but on the aspect of being slaves and eating matzah when you're still in Egypt? And the third question is, why are we inviting people now at this point? We're already sitting at the Seder. We already recited Kiddush, the blessing over the first cup of wine. We already did a few other preliminary things. And now we're inviting people? So it's obvious that this is not the invitation. If you want to invite someone, you invite them before Passover. But this is a reference to our invitation. So what's the connection? What is the meaning of it? So the Rebbe once gave a brilliant explanation, and I'm giving you only like a little taste of it. In fact, I remember when the Rebbe gave, this was in 1964, and the Rebbe had a custom that at the end of the Seder would end about midnight. At 1 a.m., the Rebbe would enter the synagogue with a few, maybe 1,000 people there, after 4 cups of wine, and after probably more than 4 cups, because during the meal you could drink more, and some people did. And the Rebbe would then sit down and expound on the Haggadah for the next 3-4 hours, till about 5 a.m. And the Rebbe would speak for, let's say, 20 minutes to a half hour. They would then sing a song, and then he would speak again for a half hour, and this would go on for about 3 or 4 hours. So that one year, 1964, he spoke for a half hour, and he just asked a whole bunch of questions on this paragraph, and he didn't give an answer. So everyone thought, well, probably the next talk will be the answer. The next talk, he took another part of the Haggadah and spent a half hour asking questions on that. And he did this for about 6 different parts of the Haggadah. And didn't give any answers. He just threw questions on different parts of the Haggadah. Then after all that, he gave one talk that answered all the questions and tied the entire Haggadah together as one continuum. It was just so brilliant. And I remember people were in such, and I wasn't there actually. I came a few days later, and people reviewed what happened to me. And this was later on published, but if it would be published word for word in English, it would be a whole book, just on the Haggadah. That was 1 year of the Rebbe's talk. So anyhow, I'm going to give you just one little morsel, one little kernel. The Rebbe said that this paragraph, which is the first paragraph of the Haggadah, even before the 4 questions which the child is supposed to ask, the Rebbe argued that this paragraph answers a fundamental question which, if not answered, any thinking person, including a child, will say there's no point for me to continue with this Seder. It's such an obvious question that if you don't have an answer for it, then what's the point in going further? So what is that fundamental question? The fundamental question is that if we're talking about the Exodus, the liberation of the Jews from Egypt, who took them out of Egypt? God took them out. It was God's miracle. 10 plagues. And later on, the splitting of the sea, which culminated the Exodus. And what did God promise with the Exodus? That the Jews would be free. Not just free, but also wealthy. God promised Abraham, hundreds of years before that, your children will be slaves in a foreign land, but I will then take them out with great wealth, which is what happened. So the child asks innocently, and he says, one second, you say God did all this? It wasn't just some very powerful military expert. It was God who does it? So how come God's actions are so flawed? Why did we end up in exile later on? Why are the Jews still suffering? Why is there terrorism in Israel today? In the year 2022, why are there such negative things happening to those liberated Jews who God himself took them out of Egypt? Secondly, why did we have to invite poor people to the Seder? We said, whoever is hungry, come and eat. Why are they poor? God took them out of Egypt with great wealth. And if they have great wealth, where did their wealth go? Why did it disappear?
Inflation.
Why is there inflation? So the answer to the question is, to paraphrase a famous quote, you can take the Jews out of Egypt, but you can't take the Egypt out of the Jew. What does that mean? We point to the matzah and we say, this is the bread of affliction. This bread that we're eating now, this matzah, which is called bread of affliction, this is what we ate in Egypt. We took Egypt with us. We took the exile with us. God does not perform miracles by changing our personalities without our own involvement. Don't think I can do whatever I want because if God wants me to be a good person, he'll change my character. He'll just snap his finger, his divine finger, and all of a sudden we'll all be perfect. It doesn't work that way. You go out of Egypt, you have to take the Egypt out of yourself as well. And that's why we point, you know why we're still here in exile, young child who's wondering why we're still in exile? It's because we took the exile with us. And why are there still people who are poor and needy that we had to bring to the Seder? Why are they still here in this state of impoverishment? Because we took impoverishment with us. Spiritual and physical impoverishment. We took it with us. As many people would say, we still had the slave mentality. But slave mentality doesn't just mean that you feel subservient to someone. Slave mentality means that you are still deficient in your morals, you're still deficient in your emotional stability. So we took Egypt with us. So then the question is, so then what hope do we have for the future? And therefore it continues that by conducting the Seder, every time we conduct the Seder, it takes a little piece of that Egypt, of that Mitzrayim, which means constraints. It takes that out of us. So even though we're here this year, we will have the power to get out of this exile. And by the time next year rolls around, we will be free. Free not just physically, but free spiritually. So the Seder is not an exercise in futility. The Seder empowers us to once and for all get the exile out of us so that we can get out of exile completely with all of its ramifications. That's the Rebbe's explanation very, very briefly. But I'd like to give you a simpler explanation. It's not at odds with the Rebbe's, of course, but it's a simpler understanding. If we want to appreciate freedom, you have to appreciate and experience the opposite of freedom. A child who grows up in affluence, who never had a problem in his upbringing, that child is very deficient. We are so designed that we need to go through and experience hardship in order to appreciate the good, the freedom, the prosperity. If you are not plugged into what happened in the times that we were slaves, and we are just focusing on the liberation, on the Exodus, we won't appreciate the freedom. And that's why the Haggadah begins on a note that seems to be negative. This is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. And then we point to the fact that there are hungry people and there are needy people. So we empathize with those needy and hungry people. And then we psych ourselves and internalize the bondage and the suffering. And then we invite, as I mentioned last week, who are we inviting when we're sitting at the Seder? And the answer is, we're inviting ourselves. We're inviting everyone who's sitting at the Seder table. Those who are hungry and really want to experience freedom, and those who don't think that they're hungry, but they're needy. There are many needy people who are not hungry because they don't even know what they're missing. Unfortunately, there are so many Jews so I tell you sure to mute the people. There are so many Jews who are very needy, but they're not hungry. They don't even know that there's something that they're missing. They don't know that there's so much wealth in Judaism and that they don't even have a desire for it because they are not informed. I remember, I'll share a little sad story. In the ninth, not letting me mute. Has to be done from his. This is not the. It was in the early 1970s when there were a lot of cults that were getting a lot of Jewish students into their grip. And there was one such student, a Jewish student, who became a follower, a devotee, if you remember. Don't tell me you remember, because that will date you. The Guru Maharaji, who was a 14-year-old at that time. I think he's no longer 14. And he proclaimed himself as a god, a demigod. And he got thousands of Jews to follow him. And this kid was taken in by this cult. And a friend of his, another Jewish kid, was trying to get him out, so he enlisted our help to try to talk him out of this cult. So I remember distinctly, I'm walking with him in the Northern Union, those of you who might remember that, and I'm telling him, isn't it a shame that this kid is going into this cult when there's so much in Judaism? And this kid, who grew up in a typical Hebrew school education of Judaism, says to me, there is nothing in Judaism. Judaism has nothing to offer. And he was 100% right from the perspective of his education. Judaism was just jingles, and that's all it was. And even though he didn't want his friend to be part of a cult, he didn't think Judaism was a substitute, because to him it had no depth. So there are many Jews who are needy, but they're not hungry, and many who are hungry. And we're inviting them to participate and to experience freedom. And only when we experience the poverty and the suffering that we went through, our people went through, and we empathize with them, then we could appreciate freedom as well. And when you appreciate freedom, that itself generates the ultimate redemption that we speak about at the end of this paragraph. Now we go to Manishtana. Why is this night? Night is spelled N-I-G-H-T, not K-N. Why is this night different from all other nights? There are 4 different questions. There are different versions of the order. The order here is Maimonides' order. All other nights, we're not required to dip even once. This night we dip twice. On all other nights, we eat chametz, bread or matzah. And this night we eat only matzah. On all other nights, we eat all types of vegetables. And this night we eat mora, bitter herbs. On all other nights, we eat either sitting or reclining. On this night, we all recline. One of the commentators, several of the commentators, point out that it's a misnomer. It's not 4 questions. It's 1 question with 4 answers. What is the question? Why is this night different from all other nights? Which means, why are we able to experience freedom tonight more than any other night? What is this night? What's so distinctive? What's so unusual about this night that enables us to experience freedom? And we have 4 answers. One answer is, we dip. Why do we dip? Because it's something we normally don't do. We change our approach. When a person is capable of changing their nature, going against their nature to do something good, that's liberating. Because we are products of our nature. So every one of us, even if you're the best person in the world, you are a product of your own habits, of your own nature, of your own personality. You're molded in a certain way, and that is what defines you, and limits you, and inhibits you. No matter how good you are, you're still limited to that level of goodness, that level of righteousness. So by dipping was something that people normally didn't do, and the official reason why we do that is to get the children to become curious and ask questions, but it really has another explanation, that it's the idea behind it is to show that we are not limited, that we're not confined to a mold. We can change on a dime. We're capable of transcending ourselves. And that's what we do this night. This night is a night of self-transcendence. That's what liberation is. Then we have matzah. Matzah is humility. Humility is what gets us out of exile, because it's our ego that imprisons us. Because of our ego, we're just focused, obsessed with ourselves, and everyone else is secondary, or not even secondary. Mora, we feel the pain. We not only experience humility, the bitter herbs allow us to feel the pain, the suffering of others. And yet, reclining tells us we are royalty, because the idea of humility is not a contradiction to feeling royalty, feeling that you're special. In fact, it's complementary. When a person is full of himself or herself, they can't really appreciate their true quality. But when a person is humble, they're receptive to their inner spirit, to their inner soul, which is a part of God, which is royalty. So the humble person is not necessarily someone who's downtrodden and thinks they're absolutely worthless. On the contrary, you know that you have tremendous value. And that's what reclining was, an expression of royalty, of freedom and royalty. Because through this changing of your habit, your ability to transform yourself, the ability to be humble, the ability to experience pain of others, empathize, that gives you the power of royalty, or enables you to experience your royalty. Last week I mentioned the Abarbanel's explanation for the 4 questions. He takes it as 4 questions, not answers, but it's really one question. Why are there so many contradictions on this night? What are the contradictions? We eat matzah. That's a symbol of our exodus. We were leaving Egypt, such a haste. We had no time to bake the bread. No time for the dough to rise. We eat bitter herbs. What does that symbolize? The bitterness of exile. We dip. Dipping could be a symbol of the exile, because the salt water is the symbol of the tears. And we recline, which is a symbol of freedom. So which is it? Are we experiencing the slavery, or are we experiencing the freedom? And the answer is yes, both. That's the whole point of the Seder, to go from one experience to the other. If you go a little bit deeper into it, matzah has both symbols. Poverty, it's bread of a poor person, bread of affliction, but it also symbolizes the freedom, because that's why we left Egypt in a haste, because we were being liberated. So that's, in the matzah itself, you have both themes. But the emphasis of matzah is on the poverty. That's what you see. You see the bread of affliction. You see bread that has no taste to it other than the simple taste of flour and water. The dipping is a symbol of wealth. Wealthy people could afford dips, but the salt water is poverty, but the emphasis is on the wealth. Bitter herbs are just bitter, and reclining is just freedom. So you have all these different paradoxes in the Seder, and that's what the 4 questions are focused on. And then we give the answer. We were slaves to Pharaoh. Let's go through this. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. We were slaves. We're talking about ourselves. What do you mean we? None of us were in Egypt then, but we're supposed to feel as if we were there. We're supposed to internalize. And the Lord our God took us out from there with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm. If the Holy One, blessed be He, had not taken our fathers out of Egypt, then we, our children, and our children's children would have remained enslaved to Pharaoh, or indebted to Pharaoh, is a better translation, in Egypt. Even if all of us were wise and all of us understanding, all of us knowing the Torah, we would still be obligated to discuss the Exodus from Egypt. And everyone who discusses the Exodus from Egypt at length is praiseworthy. So let's go through a few things over here and focus on a few things. There's a book can be written about this paragraph. First, he talks about that we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And then he says if we were not taken out of Egypt, we would remain, and again, the better translation is indebted, or not enslaved, but subservient or indebted. Why the change? And also the question is asked, why would we be slaves even now, or indebted even now? God gave a time limit how long we'd be enslaved. Once the time expired, we would automatically be free. So the commentaries explain, if we were redeemed because of Pharaoh's kindness, we would always be indebted to Pharaoh. And that's the very mentality that we're trying to get out of. And that's what exists even today, to this day. You know, this Stockholm Syndrome. A terrorist takes you in captivity, threatens to kill you, even beats you, but then feeds you and keeps you alive for as long as the terrorist so desires. And you become one of those terrorists, which is the Patty Hearst story. That's really something that we're all suffering from. You know, it's like the person who throws a person into the sea who can't swim and is drowning, and then they jump in and they save them. And you don't say, thank you? I saved your life. Yeah, but you threw me in the water. We should never accept the forces of exile, never accept that our sustenance comes from the government, or our sustenance comes from commerce, or whatever the source that we see our benefits coming from, that we should attribute everything to these forces. Those are forces of exile. We are indebted to only one being, and that being tells us we should say thank you. And to use a Talmudic expression, when you go to a party and the waiter serves the wine, it's not his wine, but you still thank the waiter for delivering the wine. So if we recognize that all the good that we have from whatever the source is, yes, we're grateful to everyone as the waiters, but the source is God. And that's why if Pharaoh would have liberated us, if God had not done it in such a overwhelming way, in such a dramatic way, we would have been thanking Pharaoh all the time. Look how great Pharaoh was to us. But then why the change? We were slaves to Pharaoh and then our fathers. So the simple answer is that it's our fathers, literally. We were not physically, literally in Egypt, but we have to try to internalize it as if we were the ones who were enslaved and we were the ones who were liberated. But there's a deeper Hasidic interpretation of what it means, our fathers. In Hasidic literature, and based on Kabbalah, on the Jewish mystical teachings, fathers and mothers are a metaphor for our intellect. Children are the metaphors for our emotions, because emotions are created based on our intellect, based on our understanding. If a person understands that there's a threat that is coming your way, it'll evoke feelings of fear. But if you didn't have the knowledge of that threat, you wouldn't be afraid. If you love something because you're told how important that thing is, how good it is, you will develop a feeling of love. If you have no knowledge, you won't have those emotions. Now, there are certain emotions that are instinctive. A baby is hungry. That's an instinctive thing. The baby doesn't have to sit down and reflect. You know what? It seems that I haven't eaten in 3 hours, and based on that, I should be hungry. So I'm going to be hungry, and I'm going to cry. Those are instinctive emotions. But any real emotion that is not instinctive, you have to use your mind. So the mind is called the father or the mother, and the emotions are the children, the offspring, the result. What happens in exile? In exile, what's worse than just the physical bondage, the torture, as bad as that was, our mind was also in exile. You know, there's a famous saying, a mind is a terrible thing to waste, but a mind is a terrible thing to have enslaved, where you're led to think not the way you should be thinking, but the way someone else is thinking for you. That's the real sinister part of exile, worse than just being a slave. You could be a slave and never lose your freedom. Whenever we would go to visit Jews in prison, I would always focus on this and tell them, you could be more free than I am. I have the freedom to go in and out. You don't. But if your mind is free, you are truly free. But if your mind is not free, then you're really in bad shape. And that is what happened when we were in Egypt. Not only were our bodies enslaved, but our mind was enslaved. And therefore, we were in big trouble. So when he says that our fathers, if he had not taken our fathers out of Egypt, if God did not take our minds out of Egypt, yes, we still had a slave mentality, but that's not to say that we were completely without a mind. We did have a mind that we didn't have before when we were in Egypt. And we got that mind later on when we got the Torah at Mount Sinai. That's why the real freedom is not when we left Egypt. The real freedom came when we stood at Mount Sinai. You know, I mentioned this last week, there are 4 cups of wine that we drink at the Seder because there were 4 expressions of liberation in the Torah. Why are there 4 expressions of liberation? So the commentaries explain because there were 4 stages of the Exodus. The first thing that happened was that the slavery, the back-breaking torture of slavery ceased. That was the first thing. But they were still slaves. You could be a slave and not be tortured. There were some very, very kind slave owners in the South that didn't beat their slaves and treated them very nicely. So that's better than being tortured, but it's still not the end. They're still slaves. The second step was they were liberated from slavery. They were no longer slaves at all, not even with a benign master. But they were still in a prison called Egypt. They couldn't leave the country, like the Jews in the former Soviet Union for decades couldn't leave because they were kept in that prison called the Soviet Union. So even if they were free to do whatever they wanted, which was very rare, but they still were not free to leave. So now that the Jews are out of Egypt, why the fourth cup? Why do you need a fourth cup? Because they were not really free until they got their mind back. And when did they get their mind back? At Mount Sinai, when God gave them the Torah. That really marked the end of their slavery. That's when they were really redeemed. So that's what we mean, that if God had not taken our fathers, it means our mind, out of Egypt, we would still be enslaved. We would be no better off than we were when we were in Egypt. Because to not have a mind of our own, a mind the way God wants our mind to function, then we're no better off than being slaves in Egypt. Then we say, if all of us are wise, we have three expressions over here. Even if all of us were wise, all of us understanding, and all of us knowing the Torah. Some of you might have noticed that there are three expressions over here that correspond to the three intellectual traits. Wise is chachamim, chachma, which is translated usually as wisdom. Therefore, the one with wisdom is called wise. Understanding is bina, and knowing the Torah is das. So even if we have all three intellectual qualities, what are the three intellectual qualities? Chachma is the idea to conceptualize, to be able to have a concept in your mind. There are many people who, if you give them a book, they'll be able to digest it and spit it out and explain everything very nicely, but they don't have any idea of what the major concept of that book is. So you have the first level is the conceptual knowledge. But people who have concepts, very creative minds, may not be able to explain their concept. For that you need the bina person. The maven would be the correct way of putting it. The one who has the ability to elucidate, to elaborate, to expand, to flesh out all the details. You want that in a teacher, not someone who just has brilliant ideas, but someone who could express them and explain them. But that's still not enough to create an emotion. You need to have das. Das is essential. What is das? Das means the ability to attach yourself to the idea, to make the idea not just something outside of you, some detached piece of information, no matter how well you understand it, but something that becomes part of your personality. And that's when you could create feelings, commensurate feelings. So even if we had all those three, that means we reach the height of our intellectual prowess. We are endowed with conceptual knowledge, developmental knowledge, and attachment knowledge. We still have to keep on talking about the Exodus. Don't stop because you think you're smart enough and you know everything, because it's infinite. There's no limit. Whoever keeps on discussing it at length is praiseworthy. Why is that? Because there's something else that was in exile. The Arizal, the great Kabbalist, points to Pharaoh. And he says the word Pharaoh in Hebrew is a composite of two words, peh, ra. Does anyone know what the word peh means?
No.
Mouth. And ra? Evil. An evil mouth. Pharaoh contaminated the power of speech. he took away the power of speech from his slaves. Because there are people who could be brilliant, but they can't speak. I know, I've heard of stories from people who suffered through the Holocaust, that they couldn't talk about it, and I'm sure everyone over here knows such people. For decades after the Holocaust, they could not express themselves, they couldn't speak. So their speech was in exile. What is the Hebrew word for Passover? Peh, sach. Sach means speak. Peh is mouth. The mouth can speak. What got them into their exile was because their speech was contaminated. Joseph, the Midrash tells us, would speak ill of his brothers. He would bring negative tidings to his father. And the Midrash says that's why we ended up in Egypt as slaves, because we perverted our power of speech. Speech is an incredible power. In fact, in Hebrew, how do we say human being? Adam could be, but if we want to describe the different classes, inanimate is called domem, silent. Vegetation is called tzomeach, growing. An animal is called chai, a living being. And a human being is called midaber, a speaker. What makes us uniquely human is that we have the power of communicating in ways that no other creature has. Yes, creatures could communicate, but it's a very limited type of communication. We are the power of midaber. So why did God give us that unique power? Because he wanted us to use it to learn and teach the values of Judaism, that we can transmit them effectively to the next generation, that we should be able to express our feelings in prayer. But when you pervert that power and you use it for speaking ill of others, you use it for speaking words that are impure, you use it for all sorts of negatives, then your speech is in exile. Your power of speech has been taken over and is in a really difficult and painful situation. And that's what Pharaoh was all about. And what was the Exodus about? Pesach, now the mouth can speak. Words that are worthy of what speech is all about. So even if you know everything, you have all three levels of intellect. You have chachma, you have bina, you have das. You still have to talk. You can't just silently meditate on the Exodus, which is beautiful and a wonderful thing to do, but that's not enough. You have to talk, and the more you talk about it, the more you liberate your power of speech and use it for the right thing. Passover doesn't start until Friday night, so we still have time. Then it says it once happened, I don't have this whole story printed over here, but there were 5 rabbis sitting together. It's not a joke, it's a true thing. 5 rabbis were sitting together, and they were telling the stories of the Exodus all night long until daybreak, and the students came to them and says, "Rabbis, it's time to read the morning Shema." So what's the point of this? So the point is obvious. It's to show you here, these are 5 greatest minds in the Jewish nation. One of them was Rabbi Akiva, and the others were equally titans of knowledge, and yet they spent the whole night telling the story. That proves the point that was just made before. But it goes beyond that. These 5 rabbis, there was something unusual about them. Two of them were Kohen. One was a Levi, or 2 were Levis, and one was a son of converts. They should have not been required to tell the story, you would think, because the Levites, Kohen and Levi are from the same tribe, were not enslaved. This is not well known by most people, but not all the Jews were slaves. If you ever read the story, Moses comes in and out with his brother Aaron, and they're not being told, "Go, you're a slave. What are you doing here?" Because when Pharaoh got the Jews to become slaves, He tricked them by not ordering them, but offering them pay to help rebuild Egypt. And Jews volunteered right away. And little by little, they were regimented into a workforce that couldn't get out of it. But the tribe of Levi said, no, we're not going to work, no matter how much money he'll pay us, no matter how wonderful the project is. We were commissioned by our father Jacob, our grandfather, great-grandfather Jacob, to be the teachers of the values that were passed down from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and to his children. And the tribe of Levi never became enslaved when they were in Egypt. They were the teachers, they were the spiritual leaders, but they were never slaves. So you would think, if you're a Levi, that means you're from the tribe of Levi, or a Kohen, why would you tell the story? Your parents were not slaves. Your ancestors were not slaves. Or if you're a convert or a child of converts, your ancestors were not slaves. So why should you be part of the Seder? So the Seder says, no. These 5 rabbis, none of whose ancestors were slaves, spent all night long because we're one people. If one Jew experienced slavery, every Jew experienced slavery. If one Jew suffers, we all suffer. And conversely, if one Jew prospers, we all prosper. There is no other nation on earth that has that intimacy, that has that unity. And that's why, no matter how much you may think you're not part of that experience, we are part of that experience.
Right.
Then, yes?
Didn't the division into Kohen and priest, didn't that happen after?
The division into 2, but the Levi was a son of Jacob,
Yeah.
and his children never became part of the workforce because they knew that they were destined to become the priests and the Levites who were the assistants of the priest, and they carried on the teachings of Torah the way it was known then.
But how did we carry on the Torah if we didn't have it until after we left?
Okay, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had many of the teachings of the Torah. They knew it. The Torah was revealed to them before it was given to the entire people. But certainly we know that Abraham stood for justice and righteousness, and those traditions were certainly passed down, but primarily through the tribe of Levi. It's also interesting, the tribe of Levi had the least amount of citizens. It was the smallest of all the tribes, much smaller than any other tribe, because they suffered less. That's an interesting thing. The ones who suffered the most proliferated the most. The ones who suffered the least proliferated the least.
But the Levites in Egypt didn't have any jobs or responsibilities like they had
No,
in the temple.
they didn't. Their responsibility was to study the knowledge of Torah that was known to them and to pass it on and to help the other Jews remain faithful to their identities as Jews. Even though the Jews in Egypt, it says, degenerated into idolatry, there were certain things that they never changed. They never changed their names. They always kept their Hebrew names, their language, they always spoke Hebrew, and their dress. They always kept distinctive Jewish dress, whatever that was in those days, because they knew that they were Jews. There are Jews today who know nothing about Judaism, may even practice another religion, but one thing they still maintain, I'm Jewish, I'm a Jew, and I'll never give up on that. I was just reading a book of a woman who was an atheist, but the moment someone suggested that she wasn't Jewish, she became very upset. What do you mean I'm not Jewish? Could you explain what it means to be a Jew? No. But I'm a Jew. Don't take away my identity as Jew. Now, Rebbe Eliezer ben Azariah was one of those 5 rabbis. He was a Kohen. And then he's quoted as saying that I'm like 70 years old, but I never was able to win an argument about a certain matter. What was the matter? It was about, do you have to recite the Shema at night? The part of the Shema, rather, that contains the mention of the Exodus. Because in the Torah we're told that we have to remember the Exodus every day. not just Seder night. Seder night, we make a whole shebang about it. We make a whole Seder about it. Every night, we just mention it in our prayers. Every day. So the question is, what about every night? And Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah said, yes, every night, but I couldn't prove it to my colleagues until another rabbi came along. His name was Ben Zoma, and he was able to find a biblical source for it. But let me focus on something else. He says, I'm like 70 years old. Who talks like that, except for young people today? I'm like, you ever hear a high school says, I'm like a teenager. That's how they talk, but there's no, what's the like over here? So the Talmud says that Rebbe Eliezer ben Azariah was actually 18 years old, but he said, I'm like 70. What exactly does that mean? So the Talmud tells a story. The sages of that time represented the greatest Jewish minds. They were like the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, and they had a leader. The leader was Rabbi Gamliel, and they didn't like the way he was leading the other colleagues, so they deposed him. It's a long story, which I won't go into right now, but now they needed a new leader. The new leader had to be the greatest scholar, or one of the greatest scholars, and known for his integrity and everything else. So they were looking for candidates for that. So the most senior members, who were the ones responsible for deposing Rabbi Gamliel, were disqualified because it'll turn into a political thing. Because we deposed him, we got the job. Doesn't look right. So they were singled out or excluded. They can't take over. So it boiled down to one young rabbi who was 18 years old, but he was so brilliant that he was competent. So he didn't accept it right away. He went home and he consulted with his wife. And his wife said, you don't look like the role. These are senior rabbis with white hair, and you're 18 years old, you barely have a beard. And overnight a miracle happened and his beard grew and it was white. And he looked like he was 70 years old. That's why he says, I'm like 70 years old. I'm not really 70. So then the question is, so why is he so surprised that he couldn't prove his point? If he was 70, he could be surprised. I'm 70 years old, I'm experienced, and I still couldn't do it. That's one thing. But if you're only like 70, so Maimonides always looks for the simple, natural way of understanding it. He says that this man was so assiduous, I think is the word. He studied so assiduously, so persistently, day and night, and he was so brilliant. He put so much energy in his learning, he accomplished in 18 years of his life that other scholars needed 70 years. That's Maimonides' explanation. But the Kabbalists give a different explanation. One of the greatest prophets was Samuel. He's the one who anointed King David. He was probably, next to Moses, considered to be the greatest prophet. And he passed away at the age of 52. So the Kabbalists say that this Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah was a reincarnation of the prophet Shmuel. You add 52 plus 18, and you get 70. That's why he says, I'm like 70, because his soul was 70 years old in this world, but he was actually, in this incarnation, only 18. There was a total of 70. So the Rebbe explains in one of his talks that there's a powerful message for us over here. That sometimes we think we're very limited. Some of us are more limited than others. But no matter how much we feel we're unlimited, that's based on our understanding that our life started at birth. No, it didn't start at birth. It started in our first incarnation, or sometimes we were here more than once. And we acquire the cumulative energy of those earlier incarnations. And then the Rebbe says, but what about the negatives of our incarnations? What happens if we were some type of villain in our first incarnation? That doesn't carry over. The negatives are erased, are cleansed. either by virtue of a person doing tshuva, repenting, or by going through pain and suffering. The good never gets erased. So we are much more endowed spiritually than our years will tell us. And that's the connection the Rebbe also makes to why we feel we are worthy of bringing about Mashiach, the Messianic age, when our forebearers, who were much better than us and much more religious and much more spiritual, didn't do it. And the answer is, we have their power as well. Their power doesn't dissipate with their passing. So we have all the holiness and the goodness of our forebears in addition to the little good that we do. That's why the Rebbe would always say, it could be one little mitzvah can tip the scales and bring redemption to the whole world. But how could one little mitzvah do it when other people had so many more mitzvahs and they couldn't do it? The answer is, the feather on the scale will tip the scales if the other side of the scale has comparable energy. Oh, we only skimmed the surface. The four sons, or the four children. What are the four children? The wise one, the wicked one, the simple one, the one who can't ask questions. And the question is asked, why is the wicked one next to the wise one? What kind of order is it going? It should be the wise one, the simple one, the one who can't ask questions, and the wicked one. He's the bottom. So the Rebbe explains that on the contrary, the wicked one is put next to the wise one because only the wise one can affect the wicked one. But it goes more than that. The wicked one is really second, not last. Why? Because the more the wicked one rebels, the more they struggle, proves that they really have a very high and holy soul. People who have very low souls, means very limited souls, will not be struggling. There's not that much profit, you could say, for someone to invest a lot of time and effort in a business venture when there's only very little profit coming out of it. But if there's a lot of profit, you'll really kill yourself to get to that point where you make this big killing. The wicked one, the rebellious one, you look at the rebellious one and you see the potential there for total transformation, which will make this person much greater than anyone else. There was a famous rabbi, in fact, he was probably the second greatest rabbi of his time in the days of the Talmud. He lived in Israel. But what was his profession before he became a rabbi? He was a highway bandit. He was a criminal, common criminal. And he's swinging like Tarzan from one tree to another, and he sees Rabbi Yochanan, who was the leading sage in Israel, swimming. And Rabbi Yochanan had a very handsome face, and he looked like a girl. So this criminal, whose name was Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, jumps in after him to grab her, or at least he thought it was a her. And when he saw it was a guy, he commented about how beautiful he looked. And he said, Rabbi Yochanan says, I have a sister who's much more beautiful than I am. Do you want my sister? Because I think you could use your power for Torah, and you would become a great rabbi. And he became his disciple, and then he became his colleague. And when Rish Lakish, as he was nicknamed, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, died before Rabbi Yochanan could inconsolable. He says, I never had any student like him, because anything I said, he questioned me with dozens of questions. And that forced me to really study much deeper level. So this criminal, this really very active criminal, became the greatest rabbi of his time, or the second greatest of his time. And Rabbi Yochanan saw that in him. He saw that based on his criminal behavior, the energy that he brought to crime, that energy could be diverted and channeled into doing good. So when you look at the rebellious child, the Rebbe, many Jewish leaders couldn't stand the youth of the 60s. They said, this is horrible. Look at these horrible druggies. Look what they're doing. They're destroying everything. And the Rebbe said, channel that energy. That's beautiful, that energy. Use it for good. And the Rebbe did that. unfortunately, not enough people joined him in that effort. They just looked down at the 60s generation. You don't want, who's the last of the four sons? The one who can't even ask questions. Some people say, who's that referring to? Not the dumb child. Why would you put him at the end? Like, it's not his fault that he's dumb, he can't ask questions. It's the indifferent one, the one who doesn't care, or the famous joke, which is worse, ignorance or indifference? I don't know and I don't care. That's the one who doesn't know because he doesn't care. It's just totally apathetic. That's the one you really have to work much harder to get. And that's the lowest possible level. But then there's a Hasidic interpretation that puts the four sons, or the four children, in the reverse order. The Chacham is the lowest. The intellectual is the lowest. The one who takes Judaism intellectually, and that's it, that's a good beginning. But it's the lowest rung. The Russia, the rebellious one, the one who's struggling with his Judaism, that's a higher level. Because it shows that this person has more than just intellect and approaching Judaism with the mind, but also has a heart. Then there's the Tam, the simple one, the sincere, simple Jew who just does everything with such simplicity and sincerity, with love and just warmth. That's a higher level. The highest level is the one who can transcend his knowledge. The Tam, the simple one, doesn't have the knowledge. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a simple person. There are simple people in this world. And they're beautiful people. I grew up, I knew a lot of simple Jews, and they were the most beautiful people. I would rather be with them than to be with some of the scholars that had tons of knowledge. But these were beautiful. The Baal Shem Tov loved the simple Jews. And he was accused of denigrating scholars because he showed so much love to the simple Jews, because he felt that the simplicity of the Jew expressed God's simplicity, God's beyond definition.
Just like the cracker.
What?
The cracker I grew up with, my grandmother. Tams. Weren't they crackers?
Tom-Toms, yeah.
Yes.
They still have them.
That's simple.
Yeah, simple.
cracker.
Simple is pure.
That's right.
Simple is pure. But then there's something even higher. The one who can't ask questions, it's not that he's dumb, but he transcends knowledge. He reaches a level of his soul that is beyond knowledge. So the highest level is the last one. That's another interpretation. These are not mutually exclusive interpretations. There are different aspects of it. I'll do one more thing. 10 plagues. 10 plagues. Contrary to what everyone thinks is that God was punishing the Egyptians and he brought 10 plagues, while it's true that this was a punishment for them and they deserved it, that's not what God does with his plagues. The 10 plagues were an educational program, 10 steps, a 10-step therapy. And I wrote a little book explaining the 10 steps that I don't have any more copies left of. But it's really, there's so many different ways of understanding the 10 steps. But that's the whole, I'll just go through the first two. The first step you need in changing your way of thinking is the water was turned into blood. Why was the water turned into blood? The Nile River was their god. That was their way of thinking. Nile is the source of our existence. It's the ultimate source of life. We have to deify it. We have to glorify it. And from that, all the other negatives of Egypt flowed from their worshiping of the Nile. So what do you do when you want to change a person's attitude? How do you disabuse them of their false notion? You turn the Nile into blood. That means the Nile is useless. The Nile that you worshipped as being the ultimate source of everything is worthless. But it wasn't enough, because that was only intellectual. When a person is told, there are a lot of kids got into cults and they were deprogrammers. And the deprogrammer could prove to them that their cult was really not what it promised to be. It's not really worthy of belonging to, but they still had an emotional attachment to it. How do you get a person away from an emotional attachment to something? By showing them how repulsive it is. When the frogs started coming out of the Nile and jumping into people's homes, into their ovens, into their mouths, into everything, it became so disgusting to them, so repugnant, so repulsive, that they were now detached from their very source of their religion that gave them the feeling that they have the right to do whatever they wanted to do. I'll go through one more step. I think it's a very important step, the lice. It says that when the third plague occurred, the lice could not be replicated by the Egyptian sorcerers. The Egyptian sorcerers were able to turn water into blood, and they were able to get frogs coming out of the Nile. But they couldn't replicate the lice. Why? Because magic has no power over things that are smaller than a barley kernel. And lice are very small. And the magicians couldn't replicate that. What does that mean? What's the message there? When a person wants to grow and develop, you know what happens to most people? When a person finds himself or herself in a bad situation, you want to become something great and something big, you eschew, you just denigrate small steps. Small things are meaningless. People say, why would God care about the small things? Why would God care if I do this mitzvah, if I do that mitzvah? It's so insignificant. Why would he care? But that's, if you're dealing with a finite being that's big, big doesn't respect small. But if you're infinite, big is no bigger than small, and small is no more insignificant than big. God, for him, the tiniest little gesture has meaning, has purpose. And that's what can make the whole difference in a person's life. Incremental changes. You don't have to transform yourself overnight and to reach the top in one fell swoop. You don't have to do everything in a grandiose way. Every little movement is valued and is precious. This week, this Tuesday, is the celebration of the Rebbe's 120th birthday. And there are a lot of different symposiums and different gatherings to focus on the Rebbe's contribution. One of the greatest contributions of the Rebbe, if you ever noticed, Chabad has mitzvah mobiles going around getting a Jewish woman to light a Shabbat candle, a boy putting on tefillin, and it met with a lot of criticism. What's the big deal a Jew is going to put on tefillin one time in his life? A woman will have one candle, 1 week of her life she'll put on to light the candle. Get them to change their whole life. That's something, that's meaningful. But one little mitzvah. And the Rebbe totally disagreed. And the Rebbe sanctified and glorified the smallest gesture of a mitzvah. Even though the Rebbe was never satisfied with as much as you do, you always have to do more, he never minimized. Not only he never minimized, he maximized the value of one little gesture. And there's a story I told many times that happened with the Rebbe himself. There was one point, people who know a little bit about the Rebbe, he would get sacks of mail every day. There was, I think, one point where he got close to 1,000 letters a day. And the Rebbe opened up every envelope himself. And when you get, and of those 1,000 envelopes, my guess is that 900 of them were negative, were about sickness, poverty, domestic strife. How many ills are there in a society? How many ills there are, that's what he got on a daily basis. And there was a point where he was very down, very crushed by getting all these letters over the course of weeks and months and years. And his aides tried to cheer him up. How do you cheer him up? By telling him, Chabad just built a huge synagogue in this city. Didn't help. And they kept on doing these things, trying to show him, look how much you're accomplishing. One day, the Rebbe got a letter from a child, and I even heard the name of the child, I don't remember it, child from Detroit, Michigan, I think a 10-year-old child or 8-year-old child, saying to the Rebbe, every day I go on my school bus to school and I say my prayers in the school bus, but there's a lot of noise and it was hard to concentrate, so I made a resolution that I will wake up 15, 20 minutes earlier and say my prayers at home before the school bus comes. And I did that. That letter changed the Rebbe's whole attitude, and he wrote this child a letter saying, and the Rebbe wrote about 100,000 letters. So this is one of the 100,000. And the letters, Rebbe's letter, and I'm quoting verbatim, at least one part of it, in translation, your letter was like cold water on a weary soul, that you rejuvenated me because of that incredible thing that you did. Woke up 15 minutes earlier to say your prayers, and that made such a difference. One little gesture. That's what the Rebbe cherished more than anything else. One little mitzvah. Because not only is it because each mitzvah could lead to another mitzvah, so that's why you should beware. If someone asks you to do a mitzvah, you may get hooked on it. It could be addictive. But even if it wouldn't be addictive, the Rebbe said, even if you know that you will never do another mitzvah, value that one mitzvah. It has infinite value. Every little gesture. And that's one of the powerful messages that the Rebbe would give. And it's of course, it's based on sources of Torah, but there's no one that I know of who has ever taken that concept to the extreme that the Rebbe has taken it. And it doesn't mean that the Rebbe says be satisfied with one mitzvah. Never be satisfied. Someone once came to the Rebbe and reported an incredible amount of donation that he gave to building of a new institution, and a beautiful thing. And the Rebbe says, so when are you going to build the extension to it or the next building? So he said to the Rebbe, are you not happy with what I told you? And the Rebbe says, I'm very happy, I'm just not satisfied. But nevertheless, the small, that's what the third plague is. The tiny little things. They couldn't replicate it because in society, small is small. In Judaism, small is big. When the small is a pure act of devotion to God, to another person, God values that tremendously. Okay, any questions? We have a program at 12:30, so I stretch it out a little. If anyone still wants to sell their chametz, which means simply that you're going through a transaction that you won't be the owners of the chametz during Passover, we have forms over here that you could fill out.